Alrighty, welcome to the video lecture on classification of life. Alright, so I want you to kind of take a look at the pictures in this screen right here. Some of them should jump out to you exactly what they are. Some of them might be a little less familiar. Alright, but they're all different, and any good scientist, any good person tends to enjoy organization more than disorganization. So it would only be logical that scientists would have come up with some sort of categorizing system of classification of all life to make it a little bit easier to understand their relatedness, identification, all sorts of things that come from classifying living things. So up here I've actually kind of given you examples of different kingdoms that exist, and you may have heard of the six kingdoms of life before, and this of course is just an example of an animal. This is an example of a plant. This is an example of a protist. This is a fungus. And this is an example of a protist, and this right here is an example of a prokaryote. And a prokaryote actually is split into two kingdoms, and that of course is archaebacteria and eubacteria. We'll get into that a little bit later, but if there were no classification system, this would just kind of be like a big pile of everything all jumbled together, and it would be very hard to distinguish and find any type of information out about any living thing if there weren't a classification system. Okay, so let's take a look at this. Catfish, crayfish, silverfish. I want you to ask yourself right now, do you know what these three things are? Can you picture these three things in your mind? Do you know one of them? All right. Could you infer what they are based on what the name here says? I mean, I know what these are because I've been teaching this class forever, but do you? Okay. Questions that you might want to ask, are they similar organisms? All right. Based on the name, can you tell me a little bit about them? Because they all have the word fish in their name, does that mean they're all fish? Are they all related to fish maybe? So here is basically what a catfish, a crayfish, and a silverfish are. And you can see that they have some similarities, but very, very different. And if you didn't know what they were, you probably didn't infer that they looked like this. Okay? Obviously, the catfish is called a catfish because it has whiskers, maybe kind of looks like a catty type of fish. Crayfish, silverfish is an insect. All right? These are all what we call common names. All right? And these are just names that people have assigned certain organisms over the years throughout history, just because of maybe what they look like or where they live and that type of stuff. It's not a very good way of classifying things, especially since the language of classification needs to be universal all over this world, and this type of classification is not universal. These are English words here. This is obviously not called a catfish in France or in Germany or in Russia. It's called whatever that language would be. Crayfish is crayfish in the US and the UK, but it's definitely not that in any other country. So this right here, this common name of naming organisms, is not a universal system. So that's a problem because science should be universal. Okay, so let's take a history lesson and figure out how we came up with this universal classification system that everybody on this planet can use. All right, so we go back to about 384 BC. You probably have heard of Aristotle. Aristotle did a lot of things. He was a philosopher. He was a politician. One of the things that he was important to science was he was somebody that looked at life and recognized that there was groups of organisms and there was differences and there were similarities, and he was one of the first people to really kind of sit there and say life should be grouped together. It should be organized. So he came up with really kind of the first classification system Of course, it's very different from what the current classification system is, but it's a kind of a jumping off point. All right. So his whole idea was that he grouped organisms as either a plant or an animal. Okay, and then he, of course, subgrouped the animal group based on the environment that they lived in. Okay, so for example, like a bat and a bird are both animals, but since they both live in the air, I guess, I mean they don't live in the air, but they fly, so Aristotle grouped them together. Okay, now there's a lot of problems with this system. First off, plant and animal is not the only type of organisms out there, but we have to remember that this is way back in time, and we didn't have microscopes, and we didn't have technology. So if you were just someone that was looking around in nature with your naked eye, you would only see animals and plants. Okay, they would be the only things that you would be able to see without a microscope. Okay, now you would be able to see fungus, but at first glance, when you look at fungus, like a mushroom or some sort of mold, it actually kind of looks like a plant. So I'm assuming that Aristotle assumed that fungus was just another type of plant, and that's what he grouped it in. All right? And then, of course, you couldn't see bacteria with the naked eye, and you couldn't see little tiny pond protist organisms. So back then, those people didn't even know those existed. All right? So that's one problem. All right? Only two groups, when there were a lot more than that. All right. Another problem is that he subgrouped them based on the environment. Okay. Now, if you know anything about a bat and a bird, yes, they both can fly. All right. Hopefully, you're recognizing that a bat is actually a mammal, and a bird, well, the bird is actually a bird. Two very different groups. Okay. So classifying them as very similar would be an error. Okay. So you can't actually sit there and classify based on the environment that they live in, because many different types of organisms live in same environments. And we know from our evolution unit that organisms will have a very similar function, structures that have very similar function because of the environmental pressure. And really, it might not have anything to do with how related they are. Okay? All right, so our first classification system, great start, but not totally what we would like. All right. So we fast forward about 2,000 years. We're in the 1700s, and we have this man named Carl Linnaeus. All right. Linnaeus was what you would call the father of classification, because he came up with the current classification system. And even though it has been modified and improved, the basic idea of what he came up with still exists. Okay, so first off, he grouped organisms based on structural similarities. All right, so for example, bats can fly, but they also produce milk for their young and have hair. So that is characteristics, structural characteristics, that would go into the mammal category. Okay, all mammals produce milk for their young and have hair, maybe not a huge amount of hair, but they all have some hair, and that would be what a mammal is. So you can see that basing it on their structural similarities is a much better way of grouping them than environment. Okay. He also decided that, well, each organism should have a name, but that name, of course, should be a universal name. All right, so we don't want to use the common name anymore. We want to use a name that's completely universal to the entire world. So he said, well, the language can't be any specific language to a country, because that's not fair. I mean, if all the words were in English, then that's not fair to the rest of the world. So he said, well, let's pick a language that actually is not used anymore. And so everybody's kind of at a disadvantage, but nobody's treated unfairly. So what he picked was Latin. So Latin is kind of a dead language. Nobody really speaks Latin anymore. But that's what he chose. Okay, and so he came up with a naming system that he called binomial nomenclature. And basically, bi means two, nomial means kind of like name. So it's a two-word naming system. Okay, it's in Latin. So every organism on this planet is given a name that has two words. Okay, so for example, humans have the scientific name Homo sapiens. Okay? And what's really awesome about this is we can tell a lot about the relatedness of certain organisms by just looking at their scientific name. All right? The first name is called the genus group, and the second name is called the specific epithet, and I'll get into a little bit more later on, but just know that binomial nomenclature, two words in Latin. Okay? I also want to point out that there's a correct way to write out a scientific name. You'll notice first off that the first word is capitalized. All right? You always want to capitalize it. The second word is not capitalized. It's in lowercase. First word capitalized, second word lowercase. All right? You'll also notice that it's in italics. We always write a scientific name in italics. Now, if you are writing this with your pencil, sometimes it might be hard to write in italics, so you can also underline it, and that kind of is a substitution for italics. Okay? But you got to remember this, because I will take off points if you don't write scientific names correctly. I know, I'm super mean. All right? So here's just some examples of scientific names. This right here is a great white shark. Great white shark is the common name, all right? But the scientific name, the universal scientific name, is called Carcharodon carcharias, and you can see it's written correctly, capitalized. It's in Latin, first letter of the first word, second letter lowercase, and all italics. Okay, this is a southern swamp lily, common name. The scientific name in Latin is the Crinum americanum. First word capitalized, second word lowercase. Okay, so you get